into Mark. This book is one of the first accounts of the life of Jesus of Nazareth. The earliest historical traditions available link this book to a Christian scribe named Mark, or John Mark, who was a co-worker with Paul and a close partner with Peter. In fact, an ancient church historian named Papias recalls that Mark had collected all the eyewitness accounts and memories of Peter, shaping them into this account. Mark did not, however, just randomly throw all of this together. He has very carefully designed this story of Jesus. In the first line of the book, Mark makes his claim about who Jesus is, the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. Now, what's interesting is that this is the only time Mark says what he thinks about Jesus. For the rest of the book, he hopes to influence you by simply putting Jesus' actions and words in front of you, as well as showing you how other people react to him. Mark has designed the story of Jesus as a drama with 3 acts. The first act is set in Galilee. The third takes place in Jerusalem. And the second act is Jesus on the way from one place to the other. Each of these acts focuses on a repeated theme. In Act 1, everyone is blown away and is wondering, who is Jesus? In Act 2, it's the disciples who are struggling to understand what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah. In Act 3, we watch the surprising paradox of how Jesus becomes the Messianic King. After the opening line, Mark quotes the ancient prophets Isaiah and Malachi, who said that God would send a messenger to Israel to prepare them for when their God would arrive to rescue Jerusalem. Mark introduces John the Baptist as that messenger, and right when you expect God to show up personally, Mark introduces Jesus. As he enters the scene, the heavens open and God's Spirit descends upon Jesus, and God says, "You are my beloved Son." Mark next places in front of us a summary of Jesus' core message. He went about Galilee, announcing the good news that God's kingdom has come near. Jesus is carrying forward the story from the Old Testament scriptures about God's rescue operation for his world. Through Jesus, God is restoring his reign over the world by confronting and defeating evil, as well as its hold on people's lives. Jesus then invites all to live under his reign by following him as a disciple. After this introduction to Jesus and his message, Mark has placed a large block of stories showing Jesus' power as he brings God's kingdom into reality. Jesus goes about healing people whose bodies are sick or broken or under the oppression of dark spiritual powers. He even does something that, for Jewish people, only God has the authority to do: forgive people's sins. Jesus' provocative actions in these stories produce very different responses. Many people become his disciples and follow him, while others don't know what to think. There are some who totally reject him, specifically Israel's leaders, who accuse him of blaspheming God and being empowered by evil. Jesus isn't surprised by these diverse responses. In fact, he draws attention to them. In chapter 4, Mark has collected many of Jesus' parables about the hidden, mysterious nature of God's kingdom. Jesus says that his message is like a seed falling on different types of soil. Some soils are receptive to the seed, but others are not. It's also like a tiny mustard seed, which seems small and insignificant, but will grow to a huge size and surprise everyone. Jesus' subtle point in these parables is that he really is the Messiah bringing God's kingdom, but it doesn't look like what anyone had expected. This growing confusion about Jesus among the crowds is related to an important, repeated idea that Mark emphasizes in Act 1. Even among Jesus' circle of disciples, there's multiple occasions where they are confused about him. Mark's highlighting how everybody struggles to really grasp who Jesus is. This brings us to Act 2, which begins with a crucial conversation. Jesus takes the disciples aside and asks, "Who do you all say that I am?" Peter answers quickly, "You're the Messiah." But then it becomes clear that for Peter, this means a victorious military king from the line of David who would rescue Israel from the Romans. For Jesus, however, the messianic vocation is to become the suffering servant king of Isaiah 53, who's going to establish God's rule by giving up his life in Jerusalem. The disciples just don't get it. They think following King Jesus will mean fame and status and importance. But Jesus makes it clear that following him is like dying and carrying a cross to your own execution. It means rejecting violence, pride, and selfishness, as well as pouring out one's life for others in acts of service and love. Jesus has this same conversation 2 more times in Act 2, and it all culminates in Jesus' important statement that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to become a servant and give his life as a ransom for many. The disciples still don't get it and respond in confusion and fear. Now, here in Act 2, Mark has placed another key story that echoes the book's introduction. Jesus takes 3 of his disciples up to a mountain where he is suddenly transformed and radiates with light and glory as a cloud envelops him. Now, this is just like the glory of God of Israel that showed up long ago on Mount Sinai. The 2 prophets who stood in God's presence on Mount Sinai, Moses and Elijah, appear next to Jesus as God announces again, "This is my beloved Son." By placing this story in the middle of all these conversations in Act 2, Mark is making an astounding claim that Jesus, God's Son, is the physical embodiment of God's own radiant glory. Through Jesus, the glorious God of Israel will become king by suffering and dying for the sins of his own people. It's a shocking claim that confuses and scares the disciples as they leave the mountain. This brings us to Act 3. Jesus makes his public, royal entry into Jerusalem for Passover, where he is hailed as the Messiah. He then enters the temple courtyard and asserts his royal authority by running out the people scamming a profit off the worshipers and stopping the sacrificial system. This kicks off a whole week of Jesus debating and confronting the leaders of Israel, exposing their hypocrisy. In response, these leaders set in motion a plan to have Jesus killed. Jesus warns the disciples, predicting that Jerusalem and its temple will be destroyed within a generation. His disciples will also be persecuted just like him, until he returns one day to bring God's kingdom fully over all the world. It all leads up to the final night. Jesus has his last Passover meal with his disciples, a symbolic meal that told the story of Israel's liberation from slavery through the death of the Passover lamb. Jesus takes these symbols and gives them new meaning. They point to him and the liberation from sin and death that will take the place through the death of the suffering servant Messiah. From here, the story rushes forward to Jesus' arrest and trial before Israel's priests and the Roman governor Pilate, resulting in Jesus' crucifixion. This culminates in a key scene that matches the important scenes in Acts 1 and 2. This time, however, darkness descends. Instead of a cloud and instead of a voice from heaven, Jesus cries out in a loud voice before he dies. What's most surprising is a Roman soldier who sees Jesus die and grasps who he is. This man was the Son of God. He's the first person in the story to recognize the story's shocking claim about Jesus' identity. The Messiah is the crucified Son of God, Jesus of Nazareth, who died for his friends and his enemies. Jesus' body is placed in a tomb. And on the first day of the new week, 2 women from among Jesus' disciples discover that the tombstone has been rolled away. An angelic man informs them that Jesus is not there because he's risen from the dead. The angel orders them to go tell the good news to the other disciples that Jesus is alive and will meet them back in Galilee. The women are freaked out. As Mark says, they fled from the tomb in terror, telling no one, for they were afraid. That's how the book ends, with Jesus' disciples showing the same kind of fear and confusion that concluded Act 1 and Act 2. Now, if you look in your Bible, you'll see that the Gospel of Mark has more. It's a longer ending where Jesus appears and speaks to the disciples. But there's also a note telling you that this ending is not a part of the original book and is only found in later, less reliable manuscripts. Now, it's possible that the original ending got lost or that Mark never actually finished his account. But it's most likely that the abrupt ending with the terrified women is intentional to make a point. The entire story has focused on the shocking claim that puzzled Jesus' disciples all throughout the story, that the suffering, crucified, and now risen Jesus is the Messiah and Son of God. God's love and upside-down kingdom were revealed when Jesus died for the sins of the world. The story ends without closure, forcing you, the reader, to grapple with this strange and scandalous claim. Will you run away like the disciples? Or will you recognize the crucified Jesus as your king? Will you go forth and tell the good news? Only you can answer these questions, and that's exactly what the Gospel of Mark is prompting you to do for yourself.